Hello, Book Passage viewers, customers. Thanks so much for joining us. Maybe it's your first time. Welcome to our YouTube channel, packed with author events and also a lot of book talks, specifically about books and book recommendations. I'm your host, Paula Farmer. For the past few years, and on behalf of Book Passage, I've organized and hosted several types of special panel events, not least of which is our annual one in honor of Pride Month. Like always, Book Passage is proud to have an event as a way to uplift LGBTQ plus voices, stories, and issues. For the next hour, give or take, I'll be talking to exciting new and established authors on the literary landscape, discussing their writings, the importance of queer books, and their take on political and social issues within the community. With that, please let me start introducing this year's outstanding panel I'm very proud of. First up, KB Brookins. KB is a queer and trans writer, cultural worker, and visual artist from Texas. Their writing is featured in Poets.org, Teen Vogue, and Poet Society of America, just to name a very few. KB's poetry chapbook, How to Identify Yourself with a Wound, and their debut poetry collection, Freedom House, have won many, many awards. KB's debut memoir, Pretty, which I'm personally in the middle of listening to and loving, was recently released, I think just May 2024. So it's available at an indie bookstore near you. I highly recommend it, or the audiobook through Libro FM. And then next, definitely not least, is Karl Dunn. Karl is a multi-award-winning advertising creative director who has lived and worked in 11 cities throughout the world. As a global citizen, Karl speaks on a broad section of topics such as diversity, equity, and inclusion, self-love, a culmination of his 25 years in international business, his personal experience of divorce, and his passion for the rights of the LGBTQ plus community. He is the author of How to Burn a Rainbow, an intimate, honest, and revealing story about divorce and self-love. Also a great title, Karl. I love that title.
Thank you very much.
Next up is someone who is graciously participating on the Book Passage Pride panel for the second year in a row. Laura Gao is a Chinese-American comic artist who became famous when she released a short comic called The Wuhan I Know, in response to the growing xenophobia in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. The comic was later used as the basis for her acclaimed and popular graphic memoir called Messy Roots. Laura was born in Wuhan, China, immigrated to the US when she was 4 years old. She grew up in Texas, but her career has landed her in the San Francisco Bay Area. And last but not least is Ann Pellegrini. They are a professor of performance studies and social and cultural and analysis at New York University, and a psychoanalysis in private practice in New York City. They write and teach on several topics, such as topics on the queer possibilities of psychoanalysis, gender and performance and religion, sexuality, and effect in U.S. public life. Their most recent book is Gender Without Identity. Man, all these books this year for this panel, wow, are just fantastic. I've had a chance to either finish all or dip into them all. I cannot recommend them enough. And they're all giving different vibes. I'm really excited that we have different genres represented this year, in different tones. Everybody's coming from different perspectives, and I love that. First of all, with everybody on the panel up and their cameras on, thank you so much for doing this again. Really appreciate it. I'm excited about each of you. I have mad respect for you, your books, and what you're doing and putting out in the world. Speaking of which, your books and your stories, my first question is to all of you, and it's kind of a general one, but I think it's important. As someone who works in the book industry, I have gratefully been noticing more specific LGBTQ plus authors getting published and queer stories getting out there in the world. Unless it's just a matter of I'm noticing it more lately, but I get the sense that it's actually we're getting more published and out there in the world, especially when it comes to literary fiction, YA, and fantasy, big time, YA and fantasy. While there may be many of those that are trying to not make those titles available or trying to kind of squash the narrative, nonetheless, they're out there. And I know most independent bookstores are making them available. We'll talk more about that part of it. But for now, I'd like to know from all of you, are you noticing kind of an upward trend to more LGBTQ plus voices and stories getting out there? And let's start off with Karl. What do you think?
Well, absolutely. My journey as an author really has just begun. So my, learning curve on and my observation of the literary world and what's out there and available has really gone to stratospheric highs. But yes, definitely. I think there's a lot of I think something I'm very encouraged by is especially in the YA space, there is this real blurring of the genders of the writers and the characters, and the uptake seems to be by everybody. And I love that. I think what really thrills me is this idea that our stories are everybody's stories. They're very personal to us, but people can all relate to them and learn from them. And I think that's wonderful. The more that we're published across genres, the more people read work from our communities, the more people see that we are just a very real, normal part of society. And I love that. I really see that across the publishing world now.
Yeah, I think it's important also that maybe it doesn't, eventually we'll get to a point where it doesn't have to be such a specific thing. There was, for many, many decades where there weren't many Black writers of color, their books being out there. And so the emphasis was on how are we going to get more of those out there and get more published and marketed. When I grew up, thank God for Toni Morrison,
Mm.
but that was about it for a long time, it felt like. So, yeah, but now maybe it's getting more to the point with at least Black and brown authors where it doesn't necessarily have to be a story that's only for that audience. That people, allies of the LGBTQ plus community, can enjoy any of these books, right?
Mhm.
Now I want to give it to Anne. Anne, you're more in nonfiction for obvious reasons. What are you finding in writing nonfiction, but stories and telling things related to that community?
Mhm. I do think that there are more books circulating, both fiction and nonfiction, that are both coming from LGBTQ perspectives, and can speak to diverse audiences as well. And I think one of the values, well, I'm going to say two of the values of what is an ongoing, I think, sort of proliferation of these books. One value is let's publish so many they can't possibly ban them all for public libraries with the attacks that are happening
Yeah.
on LGBTQ literature, both nonfiction and fiction, in public libraries across this country. And then the second is one of the reasons it's so important to see, again, this ongoing explosion, including of like niche sort of micro identities within sort of LGBTQ, is that in the past, when there were so few books that circulated or maybe that got the microphone, a book getting a microphone is a mixed metaphor, but bear with me, right? This meant that that book had to stand in for everybody's story. And that's impossible. There's no one way of being L, let alone B, let alone G. I mean, like, there's just no way. We are not. We use the word community loosely, right? But it's much more heterogeneous. So I think the diversity is so important to break down not just stereotypes, but including our own stereotypes of what it is to be any one of the, I'll use the word loosely, identities gathered under LGBTQ as an umbrella. So we want to make more space for ways of being queer, ways of being trans, and not just have this reductive notion of, oh, this is who we are, including getting to tell stories that are not quote unquote positive images. Because who's positive image, right? Whom are we trying to, do we have to please people, right? Or please a certain notion of what it is to be normal or normative. So I think we also are allowing, we have more room for things that are actually darker stories, edgy.
Yeah, good note. All those are great points. Karl, I'm sure you agree with that, and I appreciate what you're saying from the more of like a memoir type thing, which of course, KB, you can relate to. I'd love for you to weigh in because not only memoir, which falls into a very specific category of nonfiction, but also poetry. KB's our only poet here on the panel, as far as I know.
Yeah, for sure. I think that, yeah, I guess one can say that it's been an uptick and it feels like very gradual, but I mean, it feels maybe just kind of like, oh, we're going like this, but I truly think it's kind of been like this over time. Like it's not an overnight thing at all. I think at least in my experience, as an author, it just took an agent, an editor, some publishers like to be interested, right? And there are so many queer and trans books that we don't read still to this day, because there are not agents and editors and publishers and indie bookstores and libraries there to kind of like advocate, right? But the thing about suppression is it has the opposite effect of maybe what people think, right? Right. It brings people like us on this panel like to rage, right? So then we double down, right, with like trying to get our stories out, which I think is a good thing in the face of adversity. But I think, maybe we're seeing this uptick as you described due to, trailblazers. So you brought up Toni Morrison, which I definitely think is a trailblazer for Black women writers. For writers like me, I think about Leslie Feinberg's Stone Butch Blues. For a very long time, that was the only narrative that we had about the kind of like trans masculine butch lesbian experience. And I also think of like Judith Butler's like Gender Trouble. Like it was these kind of singular books that like cut through the noise of the times, right? And these singular books that I think showed the literary industry that it's not just like a niche, right? Like our livelihoods are not just niche. Because we think about, I think there is very much still to this day like a kind of like idea of like whiteness and straightness being like normal, right? And anything outside of that is like, oh, this is a like specific community, or this is like this separate thing. We even see it separated, right, in bookstores. Usually I'm in like an LGBT study section. I'm not in a poetry section, right? I'm not in a memoir section because people see it as like a special interest, right? But I think, the success of those books that I've just mentioned shows that it's not necessarily niche. It's that, they were, those books existed in a literary industry that just didn't consider them beforehand, right? Didn't consider readership of Black women, readership of queer and trans people, right? And, in the present day, we have so many more kind of books that show, including ours, right, proof that this is not a niche subject. I think of like Lamia H's like Hijab Butch Blues. I think Jason Calendar is like Felix Ever After, which you brought up YA earlier. And we have more diversity amongst, indie bookstores and agents and editors. Even for my book, me and my agent, sent it out to X amount of publishers, and 3 publishers got back to us with interest. All 3 of those publishers were publishers that had Black editors, right? So like, and that was not the majority at all. So it's like, it takes people being in those places, right? Influence in order to get, books about our people that are not just like assumed white, assumed, straight. in order to get these books out, right? So I think, you know, my book had a lot to do with me being lovingly annoying for a number of years and being like, you must listen, right? And really like first knocking and then like pushing down doors. And then it also, I think, had a lot to do with luck. Like there are just so many Black trans people that I know that have memoirs, right? They have lives worth memoirs, right? And it takes, right, someone being in the position to see that it's worthy. We still definitely have a ways to go as far as racial diversity goes. You know, my book was also born out of like me trying to find books about my experience and only seeing, you know, a white trans experience, right? And that not being how I navigate transness, because my transness comes with Blackness, right? I think also about like the subsections within subsections, but it's just like a part of queer and trans community, like queer folks with disabilities, like, you know, even like asexuality. Like there are just not a lot of books, right? From that experience. So definitely we still have a ways to go, but as time goes on, yeah, things are changing, regardless of how many people would rather it not.
I found it fascinating though, KB, you were saying that your books, poetry collection, not in poetry in a lot of stores, but specifically under LGBTQ. To me, that would be like putting Black and brown authors. I mean, they would never do that today, would they? Just say, here's the Black section. Like, so it feels a little odd. Like there's definitely room for some improvement or thinking through this and how we classify. So I'm glad you mentioned that. And I know from being on the ABA's DEI committee a couple of years, we were noticing a problem with not enough diversity among the reps, the sales reps, or maybe in the marketing departments, because it's fine if you get a lot more uptick of titles from, you know, diversity, diverse voices, but if you're not getting them pushed through marketing or sales, I don't know. Yeah, there's ways to go. But I want to bring Laura into this specific discussion. Laura, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I love all the points that everyone was talking about. I was like writing them down as people were speaking because I feel like there's a lot of gold here. And I'll just start off first with like what you said, Paula and KB, about how I think historically books about LGBTQ people or characters or topics are seen as just like this general, just like queer books, right? And like I feel like society has really evolved since that to where it's great that we start off with these books about people figuring out their identities, coming out, finding joy in that, finding pain in that. But now we're getting so many books where it's just like a kid finding monsters and, you know, they happen to be queer, or like it's someone falling in love and it happens to be someone of the same, you know, sex or gender. And it's just, we're getting these very beautiful stories that transgress just a queer label. And I think that is representative of the society that we live in today, you know. Like I am kind of like in the middle of like Gen Z and millennial, and I grew up in a very, very conservative environment in Texas. And I feel like if I had gone to a bookstore, no one, not a single person in my school would have immediately gone to the LGBTQ section. I think that's how you know that that section can be very outdated now, to expose people to things that they normally wouldn't see, right? But then once I got to college and to a lot more accepting environment, I realized that like almost 1 in 4 people I knew were part of the LGBTQ umbrella. And I think they've done surveys recently where it did show that, like, especially in Gen Z, 1 in 4 people like are part of the community. And so now I feel like books are starting to really represent that, right? Like I almost balk whenever I see a book with like a giant cast of characters and not a single one is part of the community. Then it's like, no, I feel like you're out of touch with society. That you think one of your 50 characters does not, it are like all straight, right? So I think that's like the beauty of books featuring like this representation and becoming more mainstream so that it permeates communities like the ones I grew up in that don't normally read them because they think it's just not for them.
Yeah, I mean, well, I mean, I'm going to go on to the next question, but I feel like there was a time when the only LGBTQ voice author that was being touted was Amistad Maupin, right?
Mm,
Which was great, but I felt like he held that space for a really long time. So I'm glad to see the change, obviously, with all in all categories. There's room for improvement. Um, and we need to hold feet to the fire for certain things. But yeah, we'll take what we can get for now and applaud
mm.
that. But we're going to keep pushing for more. Um, and all of you, I feel, have very unique writing journeys, like how you got there. So I want to spend a little time talking about that. Karl, many have dubbed your book um, kind of, oh, I love this. It is the gay Eat, Pray, Love.
Yeah.
To me, it's a memoir that reads like a novel, which I
Mm.
and but I want to know firstly, do you like that you got kind of dubbed the gay Eat, Pray, Love? Did you want that kind of tone? Were you inspired by that author's journey?
Oh,
Yeah.
most definitely. I mean, Elizabeth Gilbert is a writing hero of mine, and also just as a human being, I think she's an incredible human. And I've actually had the pleasure of meeting her in Berlin, and I was telling her about my book, and I said, "Oh, yeah, people are calling it the Gay Eat Pray Love." She's like, "Okay," and then she turned the copy over and saw it written up this. I was like, "What readers are calling the Gay Eat Pray Love?" She's like, well, I'm like, "Is that cool?" Because I was really not sure about that. She said, it's fine. It's totally fine." She said, honestly, but she was really supportive of it, and it, you know, my journey as a writer, you know, I came into this. Originally, this started, I thought, perhaps as a piece of therapy for me to just write my own thoughts down, and try and figure out what's going on. I was keeping a video diary of revelations and realizations as as they were happening to me. Because when my divorce first started from my husband, I went looking for a book on same-sex divorce, and there wasn't one, and I could barely find an article on it. It was weird. I mean, considering the internet has everything you never wanted on there, trying to find anything about same-sex divorce it was like a desert. And it's still very thin even to this day. So I wrote this book so that no one in our community would have to walk, you know, this road behind me and feel like they were all alone, and that it was because divorce already is very lonely. But when you go through it from, you know, in the LGBTQ plus community, there are these nuances that people just don't understand. I mean, some of the things I was finding, for instance, heterosexuals have a long history with marriage and divorce. Our community, zero history with divorce. So none of my friends could advise me, or, I mean, they were supportive, of course, but they couldn't tell me what to do, or like no one really had a clue. Nobody really knew what to say. So I wrote it for those reasons, but what it became over time, as you said, is like more like a gay Eat, Pray, Love. And the thing I'm proudest of, and the thing that I actually fought against the hardest, that was this perception that it's a gay divorce book and only gay divorced guys are going to buy it. And I'm like, no, this is a book about a human who went through this human experience. And I'm happy to say, as the author, it's connecting with people all over the world in totally different life situations. They're not necessarily members of our community, they're not necessarily divorced, but they're relating to the themes, they're relating to the toolbox and the techniques that I learned, that I was given along the way. And even the book itself is How to Burn a Rainbow is a compendium of the wisdom of over 100 people, writers, guides who popped up on the journey. But honestly, my own personal journey to try and get it published, I wrote to everyone. And granted, it was during the pandemic when I was trying to find an agent and a publisher. I mean, crickets. It was bizarre. I think there was a perception in, I don't know about our presses and why I never heard from them, but I have theories, but I don't really know because I never spoke to anyone. I never actually got anyone on the phone or an email back from anyone. But even from mainstream publishing houses, they were all convinced it just wasn't going to sell. Like they're like, this book is dead in the water. And I'm really glad that the readers in our community and really the readers from the rest of the world are showing them, no, like we can read cross genre. We can, like for instance, I can read, Rennie Edo Lodge's book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. And I can read that and go, I get this. Like, I haven't walked in her shoes, but I've walked down a lot of those same roads. Like, I can read her book and learn more about my life from her and what she's gone through. And I think the publishing industry is just, it's very slow to pick up that we're not all stuck in lanes. So, yeah, I love the fact that this is landing with so many people around the world and helping them out and changing lives. I mean, it's the stuff people write to me on Instagram is, I mean, what a privilege it is to write. I didn't really understand that. And I also never understood, for 6 years, it was my book, my book, my book. And then the minute it's published, it's not yours anymore. It belongs to everybody else out there who reads it and has their own experience of your book. And I'm really starting to learn that now. I think maybe the greatest lie we've ever told ourselves is that we're all different. And I think when people can read, we can all read each other's books and stories and get it. I think it just proves how we are so much more connected than we give voice to these days. Like division and hatred gets magnified. But I think really we're all really, really very similar. Yeah.
Well, I mean, and even if there are differences, isn't it more interesting to read about different places, different stories, different experiences? Like
Yes.
I don't need to just read about, I don't need a mirror all the time. Sometimes how am I going to learn about something I can't, I have never
Yeah.
experienced other than through a book, maybe a movie or a documentary. Obviously one-on-one talking to people. But let's face it, there are some people in the world who aren't going to have diverse personal relationships. Maybe because they're scared of it. Maybe they're not in a physical location where they can. So yeah, what an opportunity to learn about different stories and experiences. But good point. I just quickly before I go to somebody else, Karl. So how did your book get published?
I had to publish it.
Self-published.
I had a really interesting conversation with a great agent in New York, and she was fantastic. She probably saved me a year of my life. And she basically said, look, your book's excellent. I loved it. Like I really loved I was shocked it's your first book. And I thought, well, this is going awfully well. And then, but she said, I'm not going to be your agent. And anyone who says they will probably isn't very good at their job. And I'll explain why. I'm like, okay. And she said, you've taken the three hardest genres to sell, according to popular wisdom in my industry, which is LGBTQ plus divorce and memoirs by people who aren't famous. And you've combined them all into one book. And I'm like, all right. And she did say, I hope you prove me wrong. I really do. But I make my money on book sales. I look at this book and think, it's not going to sell. And I said to her, but, bringing Elizabeth Gilbert back again, I said to her, but I have to disagree on some level, which is that, Elizabeth Gilbert, like I didn't need to be a divorced woman from Connecticut to read Eat, Pray, Love and get a lot out of that as a reader and as a human. It's like a journey to find yourself that was set off by a divorce. That's what I wrote. And she said, yeah, but that's different. And much to my surprise, I said, yeah, I know. And it really bothered me that we'd agreed on something and we hadn't named it, but both knew it to be true. Really bothered me until I heard Alok Menon, who I think is one of the greatest thinkers from our community. Alok is, I mean, when they speak on gender, it's like a masterclass. It's incredible. I've learned so much from Alok. But they said in this podcast, there is a perception out there that we are here for the world's entertainment and not their education, that they believe they have nothing to learn from us. And when they said that, I was like, that's what we were talking about. Comes back to your original point of this idea of us being stuck in this idea people have of who we are.
Yeah, yeah, good point. And I'm going to bring you in at this point. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm assuming your writing journey was born out of maybe your career, your passion, what you do, psychoanalysis and things like that, or am I wrong?
You know, I'm based in a university. I've been teaching post-PhD for 30 years now. I teach at NYU. And so one of the expectations of being a faculty member is that you will indeed write articles and books. So that's something I've been doing for a long time. But the most recent book, Gender Without Identity, I actually co-wrote with another psychoanalyst, Avi Sakatapulu. And co-written books are not the norm within the humanities, which is where I'm more or less based. At the university, I'm based at actually the School of the Arts at Tisch. So a co-written book is already unusual, but I love co-writing. I've written 2 other co-written books as well as a solo book. I guess, and I'm thinking 3 co-written books now, and I love it because here's the thing, that no thinking we do is ever solo, but most often you're used to getting a book that has one name in the title, like one signature, but we can't think alone. I mean, if we try to think alone, then we're not going to think very well. So it's a pleasure and it's a challenge, and it's so rich just to have that opportunity to co-write with someone. And the book that Avi Sakatapulu and I wrote, we didn't mean to write a book. We actually wrote an essay together, which won a prize from the International Psychoanalytic Association. That's the oldest professional organization in the field of psychoanalysis. It was actually founded by Freud. And we won a prize for work in gender and sexual diversity. And part of one of the aspects of the prize award was that we would have the chance of its being published in the International Journal of Psychoanalysis, which is the oldest journal in the field, also founded by Freud. It's a very prestigious publication. So we submitted the essay, the editor said, great, gave us some revision suggestions. We did revisions in the midst of the year in which we were revising. There was an editorial change. We submitted it again. The next editor said, wonderful, we want to publish this. So we were told we're going to publish this twice. We got revisions, and we were told we didn't have to do more revisions, but we liked the comments and questions this editor gave us. We did some more. Everything's the green light, green light, green light. We hand in the last version. And we add an acknowledgements, which is very standard in a book and an article as well. And one of the things we said in the acknowledgements is we called out the blood that is on the hands of psychoanalysis when it comes to queer and trans people. And one of the things we said in our acknowledgements is we hope that in the future, that no other queer and trans people have to experience what generations have at the hands of psychoanalysis. And we called in psychoanalysis to recognize that queer and trans people are not simply our patients, they are our colleagues, there are teachers, there are supervisors, there are analysts, right? That was in the acknowledgements. And at that point, everything changed, and the journal ultimately wouldn't publish the article. They said they'd only publish it if we removed, they actually sent us back the article with in highlight the lines from our acknowledgements we had to remove as the new condition of its publication. And Avi and I talked about this a lot. We are both published authors. We've both published a lot. So we had the luxury, I suppose, of not needing this publication. I'm a full professor at NYU. I didn't need this for a promotion. So it was still it was not an easy decision, but ultimately we decided we could not do the excisions of our article that were demanded, because we are psychoanalytic practitioners who work with a lot of queer and trans people, both members of the queer and trans community. We are committed to the flourishing of queer and trans people. We couldn't take those sentences out. So there's a longer story, which we talk about in the preface. There were threats of a lawsuit. It got messy. But now we had this article, which we'd spent a lot of time on, and we had to decide, what are we going to do with this? So we turned it into a book, and we approached a very small press. It's a very small psychoanalytic press called Unconscious in Translation. It's run on a shoestring. This is, again, a not-for-profit press. It publishes in English the work of Jean Laplanche, who's a very important French psychoanalyst. And we use Laplanche in our book, and we approached the press and said, would you be interested in this? We develop it into a book. And Jonathan House, the founder of that press, said, go for it. I love this. So we published a little book that is speaking to other psychoanalysts, it's speaking to other therapists, and it's also for people who are interested in gender. And we're arguing that no one is born that way, that all gender is a creative acquisition. Everybody becomes a gender. No one has one at birth. No one, whether a core identity that's psychologically immutable or somehow in our DNA or chromosomes or the interior region of the hypothalamus, right? It's against the born that way argument, and it's talking about the development of gender and coming into gender. And it's making the argument that instead of apologizing for our existence by saying, oh, we're born that way, that's why you shouldn't discriminate. The reason not to discriminate against queer and trans people is that there's nothing wrong with being queer or trans. And everybody becomes a gender and becomes into a sexuality. And we need to have more complex conversations. So, and even as we had a horrible experience with the journal, ultimately, I'm really glad we got to write this book because it's reached many more people. And we got to say what we wanted, and we got to say it in some sense, again, on behalf of a community that we really believe in.
Wow. I mean, we've only had two of you talk about your journeys and your challenges, and there's like a book within those two so far. I want to commend you, Ann, and your co-author. Instead of being discouraged and throwing in the towel, that you said, hey, let's take it up a notch and we'll publish it as a book. So thanks for that. And now, Laura, I know in the introduction, I mentioned kind of where your book was coming from a little thing we all kind of experienced in 2020, the pandemic, and how that really also very much turned against your hometown. But I'd like you to kind of expand on that more. What was that? What were you thinking while all this was going on, and that actually inspired you to put pen to paper about that experience, and also why that genre? You could have gone a lot of different directions, but you specifically went with more comic. Is it comic, or should I be saying graphic novel? How you know?
Yeah, it's a graphic novel.
Graphic novel.
It's a graphic novel. Yeah. I wouldn't call graphic novel specifically a genre. I think I see it more as a medium, but I would say the genre I went with my book is ultimately a memoir. And I went with a memoir because, one, it made the most sense of I have this background in which I was born in Wuhan, spent my early years there. And during the pandemic, almost all of my family, besides my parents, my brother, still live in Wuhan today and have been. And when the pandemic hit, I remember it hit right when my mother and I were about to make our trip back to see our family in Wuhan. And we were going to go see my grandparents who had just turned 80. It was a huge deal for the family. And so for a time that was supposed to be for celebration and like the happiest for our family to suddenly turn into one of the most horrific events, in recent memory for all of the world, was just such a heart-shattering thing for me to deal with. That at the time I was in San Francisco, I was working here alone with my roommates, and I remember just the dissonance of because it was still very early on, there weren't that many cases in the US yet. I think people had been treating it a little bit more like a joke early on rather than like the big deal later. And I remember just watching the news and talking to coworkers and friends, and people would just make jokes about Wuhan, about the virus, about China. And I would hear that during the day. And then at night, I would open my phone, get on WeChat and call my family, and we'd have our family chat. And I'd have to hear about, which of my family members went to the hospital that day, which of them are, like worried about another neighbor, family member. And I remember this dissonance was something that my mind just like could not understand. And so as someone who grew up drawing a lot of art as a way of like, therapizing and just like getting my thoughts like out onto paper as a way that I can really help heal myself, I just started to make just daily comics about how I was feeling during that situation and what was going on with my family, what was going on with like me in San Francisco, my parents in Texas. And then it wasn't really until the very first case of anti-Asian hate crimes here in San Francisco, which I believe is where like one of the first big waves really hit, to where I realized like this isn't just a isolated situation in China. Like this is going to be something really big that will affect the whole world, both as a pandemic, but as a pandemic of hatred and xenophobia and racism. And so that's when I realized like I can't just keep private about these thoughts. I've just been doodling into small daily comics. And as you said in my bio, that's when I kind of took a week of mental health off of work, and I just sat in a cafe and thought, can I really like channel a lot of these feelings and explain to the world what I was thinking? Because I thought about how growing up, I was one of the only Chinese kids in my town, and like all the racist things I heard growing up and how that was like coming back again in the news and everything I had heard during the pandemic. And so I kind of put that all on paper. And I also wanted to just really highlight and like give a love letter to my hometown, this place that I would visit every few summers, and how much I love the food, the people, the culture, the history, the things that in the news they were not telling you, the things that they left out because they didn't want you to humanize this beautiful place. They want you like to feel sympathy and realize that the world has to band together. Instead, it was just like a, pointing fingers game and like a blame game. And so I put this all into a comic called The Wuhan I Know, where I talked about the beautiful cultures and like the things I love about hometown, but also talking about the anti-Asian racism going on. And I posted it online to my like 2 followers, thinking I would get like a few pity likes. But then next thing I know, it ended up going viral on Twitter. And that was actually how everything kind of kickstarted my career. A lot of my art got noticed then by agents and publishers, and I had that comic get featured on NPR. And that NPR comic or that NPR article was actually how my current literary agent reached out, and she immediately was like, hey, like even though this is like a tiny, just like a 10-panel webcomic, I can hear the emotion you've put into it. I can see the like love and the talent that you have. And she told me like she was here for me, and if I wanted to write a bigger story that, based on the fact the comic went viral, it means the world was also ready to hear it. And so I think that was really just the boost I needed to take it to the next step. And that's how I ended up with a book deal to create Messy Roots, which is my debut graphic memoir back in 2022. And the reason I chose to do it in graphic form was, I've always been an artist at heart, artist first and a writer second. And so it just was very clear to me, like if I wanted to put someone into my shoes, to basically like teleport them into Wuhan and have them just taste the beautiful food and love the beautiful people like I did, then I wanted to do it in a form that was illustrated so kids everywhere can just jump into the shoes immediately.
Wow. And we're all better off for it. That's incredible. And where did you get the title? Where's the title coming from?
That's a great question. Originally I was going to name it after the comic, The Wuhan I Know, but then as I got to final drafts of the book, I realized that the story surpassed just about Wuhan. It talked a lot about my family's immigration journey, and I also talked a little bit about what it was like to be queer and Asian, because a lot of emotions around being othered, whether it's because of race or sexuality or what have you, like they are all recurring parts of livelihood. And so I realized like, hey, this book has really blossomed more than just being about my hometown, but obviously the hometown was like the root of it, right? So I think just kind of throughout the story, we realized that I had used a lot of imagery around roots. There's a part where my mom gets cancer, and then I'm helping her kind of like cut her hair, and we talk about how like beautiful and strong the roots are, because like my hair, my like texture and the thickness of my hair comes from my mom. And then we talk about these lily pads in this pond in the countryside of Wuhan that my cousins and I used to play in, and talking about how like deep those roots went into the pond, and how in a few years that pond will be gone because the countryside is being torn down every day, as we know, for a new city. And so I think a lot of this imagery just shows how roots can stay still, but they can also change with every new home that you take in for yourself and every new life that you give yourself.
Oh, that's great. Amazing, amazing. KB, you're up next. I've got to say, I mean, listening, I'm so glad you narrate your own book. Obviously, usually memoirists do, but I love your voice. I mean, I love your physical voice telling the story, but it's a very, very intimate, personal story, and some of it's hard and heartbreaking. So I'm definitely interested in your journey and going from writing articles and then poetry, and now here's your first full-on memoir. What was your journey? How did you get there?
Yeah, in a way, I think it was kind of a lifelong journey. I don't know. I like, since I was very young, had a sense of like gender trouble, in the sense of like, I don't fit in and I don't understand why. And I'm like really trying to fit in and it's just not working. Right. And not kind of having the language for like what it was that other people saw in me, and that also I saw in myself, that was like, okay, girl and boy, or like, insert sexuality, you're just not kind of fitting in. Um, More specifically, I think the tipping point for this memoir was in December of 2020, during the pandemic year as well, the beginning of the pandemic, I should say. I started just kind of having lots of thoughts, about the past and also the future, and also how I'm feeling in the present about my gender, right? And how I was kind of like spending lots of years kind of holding off on transitioning, because I was like too worried about like, what my family would say, or like what my community would say, because I like spent, so many years like internalizing these ideas of like, oh, this is how you be trans, right? This is how, this particular thing is supposed to manifest, right? And even within queer circles, I was having a hard time like fitting into the boxes of like binary transness. Or I was like, I don't really fit, and that's not really my goal, like to pass, right, as a cisgender man, right? So I was like, oh, I don't know. But then I started ultimately taking hormone replacement therapy, and also had surgery, right, in 2020. And I kind of felt like I saw between 2020 and 2021, like the perception of me change before my eyes. Whereas, like, we say these things like, okay, misogyny exists, sexism exists, but I like kind of saw it literally just like the way that men would all of a sudden like just be so much more chummy with me, right? Kind of treat me more like a person. And then women in particular, and femmes and folks, because my blackness, right, comes with transness, it was this just like very small window of emotion that I could like show, right? If I was like any kind of unhappy, people immediately thought I was going to be like volatile and violent because of public perceptions of Black men, right? So I was kind of experiencing this violent kind of re-socialization process as my voice got deeper, as I grew facial hair, as my chest flattened, right? So I started kind of looking for literature about that, really, literature about the experience that I was having, bodily as well as like socially, and I was really, drawing a blank. Like I wasn't finding something that really fit my experience, because our current depictions of transness are so whitewashed, in ways that we may not see in everyday life. But when you think of trans people in media, it's often like white trans people, right? When you think of trans folks in literature, first, I want to say, because it sounds like a lot of our experiences, independent publishers, I think, are like a really big reason why we even have like a proliferation of queer and trans books right now.
Mm.
Because like top 5 publishers and publishers with corporate and governmental interests, like often are not the first people, right, to give us like a way into the literary industry. Often those top 5 are like your second, third, whatever book, because they have to catch up. They often are like very risk averse, right? Risk
Mm.
averse, and like if we don't think it'll sell, then we're not gonna buy it. Anyway, so yeah, I started looking for literature about my experience, was really drawing a blank. So then I started kind of writing and talking to people, just like, hey, are you also experiencing this? Like talking to Black trans men, Black trans masculine people, Black studs, and being like, oh, yeah, are you seeing the things that I'm seeing? And it was pretty common, right? The experiences that I was talking about, like, hey, I went to the gynecologist's office for like a yearly checkup, and people just assumed that I was a husband waiting for his wife, kind of thing, right? That's just like one example, and I write about that in the memoir. Or like, I had to go through this really large ordeal to get my name and gender marker changed, right? In Texas, right, you have to get a doctor's letter that says that you have a gender identity disorder in order to get your name and gender marker changed on the basis of like transness. So think like, right, you get married in Vegas and you get your name changed like the next day. It's like not like that, right, for trans people, not just in Texas, but in a lot of different states in the US, right? So I started writing about these experiences because I mean, I guess I didn't realize it at the time, but I was living a kind of like extraordinary life, right? Like I was living through experiences that other people just didn't know enough about, right? And like really facing a lot of ignorance when I wasn't talking to other people who like understood what I was saying. So I started writing those things. I started pitching them to different places like Teen Vogue, Huffington Post, etc. Some published those things, and then I started realizing like, oh, they are really all about these themes, right? Like Blackness and transness and masculinity, and how I've kind of navigated those things throughout my life. So then I put them all in a Google Doc, right? Then I sent some emails to some agents, some said no. Luckily, I got with my current agent, Annie DeWitt, at the Shipment Agency. Then we sent them out to publishers. Knopf, was a publisher that we went with. So yeah, I think that's the making of the book, but I think it took really just like conversations with my community, right? I think it also took like me not giving up when I was told no. Cause surely I got told no, like on some really like racist, transphobic, like types of things. Like, oh, one editor told me like, oh, I just don't think I understand these cultural references, so I won't be the best editor for this book, right? And it's like, that person also like edits fantasy. So it's like, you can get Dungeons and Dragons, but you can't get like a Black trans experience.
Wow.
Right. So it's like, certain people don't see our stories as worth the effort. So then they will come up with
Yes.
excuses as to why they can't like amplify those experiences. And often I think people are pitting themselves with like how much power you actually have, right? If you're an agent, if you're an editor, if you work in sales, if you work in publicity in the book industry, you have a lot of power as to like what books get published and also what books get attention, right? Because there are lots of amazing books out there too that just don't get the same attention because they don't have the like resources behind them, right? They don't have a sales team that knows like, hey, maybe this Black trans memoir does not just get sent to the New York Times, was just publishing like anti-trans stuff, every week it seems. Maybe instead you send that to Auto Shadow, maybe instead you send to them. Maybe you try to place this book at, this independent bookstore in San Francisco, right? So it's like it takes a team, right? An author is not just like, it's not just on the author to make a book happen. Like it's also on all of these other people in the industry to make it happen. So I don't know. I think again, I was just sending emails at one point, like every day, and I was just writing really into like writing myself into history, right? Because I didn't see myself in the world, and I wanted to see myself, and I wanted to see people like me, because we all got it, but it seemed like everyone else did not. And I don't want another, trans person of color, right, to go through, their transition in the belly of a pandemic, or in the belly of like a experience through life of people not getting it, right, and for them not to at least be able to find a book, right, that they can read, that they can turn to, that shows them like they're not the only person experiencing this. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm hearing from all of you, that there's a common thread. You all had such a passion, although these were personal passions, but you knew they would reach and touch a larger community, either consciously or unconsciously. You knew it and you kept pursuing it. And that is so commendable, because I know firsthand the publishing industry is not for the faint of heart, you
Yeah.
know, and there are a lot of noise out there. And, I'm surprised, and I'm not surprised at your story, KB, about the fantasy, was it agent or editor? who
Editor.
Fantasy, but can't touch actual reality, or using that, like you said, it was a convenient excuse. And then what's really disturbing is when you think about uh, how a lot of these very same publishing houses, have dismantled their DEI, or like their head of DEI, because we've arrived or something, and it's like, no, it takes a DEI manager over the sales department, the marketing, the acquisition. Who are you going to promote, and how are you going to promote it? So I hear a lot of common things within your unique journeys and stories. I want to touch on a couple, although we've basically been circling around, definitely social issues and political issues, but there are at least one or two that I wanted to specifically hear from you. And I'm not going to take it to all of you, just whoever feels comfortable speaking to it. But I want to point out, in my limited research, obviously we're all painfully aware it's a big election year this year, presidential election year, with a lot on the line. There are also a lot of local and state elections coming up, and issues. In 2024, anti-trans bills continue to be introduced across the country. There is legislation that seeks to block trans people from receiving basic health care, education, legal recognition, and the right to publicly exist. KB, you were just kind of speaking to this. There's also an overwhelming amount of curriculum censorship bills, right, related to LGBTQ. With that, is there anything related to that any of you would like to speak to, especially knowing that this is going out during an election year and such an important one?
I mean,
I was going to say something quick, which is that you led off, Paula, with the question of sort of what are we seeing in terms of, and is there an increase, an uptick in LGBTQ publishing? And I think there are more stories circulating, both through the media of literature, graphic novels, but also in television and film, and that's all fantastic. But representation is not enough, in part because representation also brings with it a backlash. And part of what we're seeing, and especially in the fierce focus on trans children, which is cruel and reprehensible enough, and it's also a wedge issue to try to go after trans adults. And it's also about sort of let's cinch back up the binary gender model, because it's about restoring the American family to a particular model that actually never really existed, right? This fantasy of going back to the past. But representation is not enough, because it can, again, unleash a backlash, but it's also not enough in another way, because, it's wonderful, again, more books, more TV shows, more films, but we can sometimes maybe think, oh, we've made it, right? But you can buy this book. You can sort of rent this, like go and rent this film on Amazon. But that is not itself social change, right? And it's like how to think that that social justice movements take a lot longer than just a boom in publishing. So I think, again, representation is not enough. It's important, but we shouldn't maybe put all of our chips into that basket because it will not serve us.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I can also add, kind of speaking to what you're saying, and also I think it's like a phrase that I've heard very often, especially online, is like do the reading or read a book, right, as it pertains to queer and trans issues and speaking to and speaking against bigotry. But I don't think it's enough to read the book, right? I think you have to do the reading and then let the reading change your life. As in, like, once you've read a book, think about like how is this going to change like my everyday life? How is this going to change my relationship to who I do and don't vote for, what I do and don't buy, what I do and don't say when I see bigotry happen in front of me, right? And what I do and don't ask for from the structures around me, right? We all interface for like with the medical field. We all interface with we spend money every day, right? So thinking about like what are those things that I can change, because surely there are things that you can change based on reading the books of us on this in this conversation. So like with my book, right, it is, I think, a very place-based book, but I think it's like very comparable experiences happening elsewhere. So just last year, 49 out of 50 states tried to pass the anti-trans bill. So there's this like idea, right, that it's like a Southern thing, right? Like that this is happening in the South. Like, no, it's very much happening in New York. It's happening in LA. It's happening in Chicago. It's happening in all of these like liberal safe havens. And it's happening under a Democratic president, right? So I think we have to start, right, like reading the literature. And I definitely implore folks to read so they better understand, right, the experiences of folks like me, folks like Laura and Karl. And I think thinking about, right, how you can change what you asked for, because there are very practical things I'll tell you, in Texas that you can do, right? For example, there is a drag ban happening in Texas pretty constantly, Texas senators and legislators legislators at large trying to ban like drag brunches and all of those kinds of things. And what I've seen my community do is rely on the people who live here, right, and the organizations who can give you calls to action, like Equality Texas, like the Transgender Education Network of Texas. Every state has a comparable organization, right? So like keeping up with those people who can tell you like, hey, here's how you write your senators. Hey, this is where we really need you to be in order to lobby these senators to, change their points of view. Here is, what we need you to donate in order for our, lawyers and things like that to be on the ground to help people, right? So making sure that folks are tapped in, right, to their favorite authors, of course, but like also to their like local kind of organizing so that they can, actually let the book change their life, right? I think it's like it's great, and it's like an ego stroke, right, for someone's book to be read, but that's definitely not enough, right? The book is not the work, the book is the work, right? The book is a part of the work, I'll say, right? Because we don't have any like non-artful social movements, and we're living through, right, and we're about to have a moment where we have a very large presidency happening, a large election happening, and I think there's a place for everybody to be asking for more and not just voting based on, what party someone is affiliated with. Because I don't know, tweets from Joe Biden that say trans people, I have your back, just haven't really done anything for me or the people that I love, right? So like asking for more, right, from the people who represent us, and also getting tapped in with, I mean, like local, like your city, your state, what you can do, and the book, where you can use the book to your advantage. A thing I love seeing and the thing I love hearing about is like when people bring, the book to abolitionist conferences, right? When people bring the book to this political sphere, like a protest, right, and give out free copies. When people use the book for charitable kind of donations, right, like, hey,
Mm.
I'm always happy to like donate a signed copy of my book if people need it in order to, raise money for things that actually like matter, right? So, getting creative with how you let the book change you.
Yeah, I like that. Both you and Anne are saying a lot of the same thing as far as it's not enough to read, to get published and to be read. It's you want your readers to be inspired to action. And when you brought up the bills, specifically 597 bills, anti-trans and other LGBTQ
Mm.
bills are out there in 43 states. So yeah, definitely not just a Southern thing. And not just a presidential election thing, it's local and it's state. And we all need to be aware and need to vote accordingly. And then once people are elected, hold their feet to the fire.
Mm.
Don't let them feel like, oh, I got in there and I can do whatever I want. Unfortunately, we don't have time to even get into the book banning thing. I will say this, and maybe Laura can kind of jump in on it, but banned books are predominantly queer books and Black and people of color. Not all, but
Mm.
that's the largest majority, and it's still an issue that we all should be concerned about and fighting against.
Yeah, I just quickly on the book ban stuff. The interesting thing is I had learned that Messy Roots was banned in a library in on the East Coast last year. And I remember a lot of my friends have had this experience as well, who are also authors, who are folks of color or queer. And when I had reached out asking, oh, like, can I get more details about this? The library had actually released a lot of forms that people have to fill out when they're requesting to take out a book. And if you read those forms, the majority of people will actually very unabashedly write that they did not read the book, but that they had an issue with it because it was espousing like bad things to the kids, right? And they won't say what bad things, but you can just tell because, as you said, Paula, like these books getting taken out are featuring queer characters, characters of color, and so I think that's the interesting thing is that you read stats saying that they will analyze these book challenges over the last few years, and the majority of them were submitted by the same like less than 10 people. So it's a very coordinated effort that you see. And the thing about graphic novels too is that it does very, very unfairly target graphic novels. Like when my friends Maya Kababe with genderqueer. The interesting about graphic novels is for these people who very clearly do not read the book, it's a lot easier to turn to a page that maybe shows two girls kissing,
Right.
or a lot easier to turn to a page where someone has gotten top surgery. And immediately a parent can point to that and be like, this is porn, or this is, for kids, instead of a parent having to actually read the book, maybe about a queer character, about, a trans character getting top surgery, and then understanding the true literary and emotional value this has for kids. So that's just me kind of saying sort of the laying the land of what other authors and I who for other authors who will be watching this, I hope you can Google Authors Against Book Bans. It's an organization that a few of my friends here in the Bay Area are a part of, and actually many authors across the nation have started to try to have a more collective effort to where you sign up for your current state. So I'm signed up here in California, and I will get news about any Californian schools or libraries or districts that are facing this. And then what we do is like we all get together, we'll all try to drive there, go to the school board, go to the town halls, talk to our experiences as an author of why it's so important for kids to get this. And we're hoping by really affecting a grassroots scale, with everyone kind of being more impactful with their home state, that we can get something going on. So those are my 2 cents for authors against book bans.
That's great. No, I love it. And not just the authors, but the readers and people, people in the book industry, or just people anywhere that read and want to support
Yes.
authors of diversity and diverse stories. I love that you're showing up and
Yeah. Yes.
taking them to task and giving more information. Thank you all for being not just talented writers, storytellers, but also just being agents of change in your world and beyond. So thank you from me personally, and from Book Passage, and from the book world. Thank you for doing what you do, and keep doing it, man, and keep inspiring us. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you to the Book Passage audience that's watching this. Pass along the link. This has been a great discussion. Share with friends and family, and buy each and every one of their books, and recommend it to other people. These books are life-changing. So thank you once again. And until I get to interview you or set you up with individual events, which I believe all of you deserve, and Karl's about to have. Be well and keep doing what you do. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Paula.
Real
Thanks so
pleasure.
much.
Thank you.